Shalom and welcome to another session in our ongoing series called The Life of Christ in Context. Our guest presenter today is an old friend of mine from our Jerusalem days together as students back in the early 80s. His name is Steve Hudson, and Steve is going to talk about the chronology of Jesus as it relates to the discipleship model that he will be sharing with us as well. Now, this session will be split into two, so somewhere halfway through or so, we'll pause and we'll resume another session to finish up this particular theme of the chronology of Jesus. And then additionally, just so that you know, we will do another session specifically on the Passion Week of Jesus in Jerusalem. So I hope that you are ready for a great session together with Steve, and we will begin now. So thanks for joining us once again. I am really enthused about this next session that we're going to enjoy together with my good friend Steve Hudson. I'll introduce him in just a moment, but this session is all about the chronology of Jesus. And as we have been talking and aiming to see Jesus through the lens of the historical, the geographical, the archaeological, the chronological, which is our focus today, although they're all blended together, the cultural or the Hebraic, as well as the soteriological or the redemptive purpose of Jesus. I'm thrilled to be able to invite Steve to share about the chronology specifically, and not only, as we have been talking about, where Jesus lived, who he was, what Jesus did, where Jesus taught, how he taught, what he taught and why he taught. But all of this is going to provide some chronological context for the scope and range of the ministry of Jesus. So, Steve, it's a pleasure to greet you and welcome you to this session. Tell us a little about yourself, your ministry, before we get started.
Thanks, John. Great to be with you. Love all that you do with and through your ministry. And I have served in 3 local churches over the years in a variety of roles. I've also served with 2 organizations longer term in leadership, both of those focusing on disciple making. Right now, I have reached retirement, and so I am not gainfully employed, but I'm still doing a bunch of coaching and training in India and Africa and a little bit of consulting along the way.
Wow, good memories of playing ping pong with you back at what was called the Institute of Holy Land Studies, now JUC. And by the way, for any of our listeners, if you're interested in a great program, a semester or even a year or two away from the States in Jerusalem, JUC would be a great choice because how much did we learn about context there, Steve?
Wow, context and geography. That's where I fell in love with the geography of Israel and where Jesus did things and when and with who. It all fits together so much in terms of the message of the Gospels. And it was really fun playing ping pong with you too. And I remember on Thursdays back then, I was a little bit older than the rest of you, and I would take a hike around Jerusalem and I would say, I'm going to explore someplace. And I know a few times you came with me and we checked out back nooks and crannies of churches and all over the Jerusalem area. And that was over 4 decades ago, John.
No, it can't be right. Can't be right. But
Was. Yeah.
good times back in Jerusalem. But your focus, Steve, is on discipleship. So I'm going to invite you to take the steering wheel, and I'll maybe inject a few comments, but I want to really learn from you today as it relates to the chronology of Jesus and the building of disciple making.
Thanks, John. And I start out just thinking in terms of the fact that so many of us focus on the message of Jesus, and that is so, so important. I grew up with a red letter Bible. Maybe some of our listeners did too, where every time Jesus spoke, the words were printed in our Bible in red. And so the message of Jesus is very important. And then sometimes we look a little bit further at the methods of Jesus, and we'll note that he got away to pray, and we'll note that he built relationships, and that methodology is really important, but we rarely get to the model of Jesus. And John, I'm convinced that if you look at a chronology of the Gospels, you're going to see a clear model of what Jesus was trying to do in terms of building a movement of multiplication. And you and I were the downline of that model today. And so one of my main tools for looking at a chronology is a harmony of the Gospels. I know a lot of people maybe not have heard that term, and most people have not read a harmony. And just like it sounds, I mean, I think back to my musical time. I used to serve in worship in a couple of churches. And back in the day, you had four-part harmonies. And you had the soprano line, the alto line, the tenor line, and the bass line. And in those harmonies, sometimes all four sang, sometimes only one or two of those parts sang. And then the notes wove together to give you the whole song. That was the harmony. And a harmony of the gospel does the same thing. It looks and tries to harmonize the different sections of the gospel into one continuous flow. And John, there's a few different harmonies. One of those kind of paraphrases, and it takes all four gospels and mashes them together into kind of one main flow. I'm less of a fan of that personally, because that harmonizer is picking and choosing what he's pulling together there, what he or she is doing. And so I would much rather have kind of like a four-column that never changes the text of the scriptures at all. And with that, you're going to get 100% of what the scripture is written, and then it's going to be put in a chronology.
Hmm.
And so that's what I use, and you're looking at a chart, and I've been very involved with an organization called Sun Life that started in the United States. And the leaders of Sun Life, and I chaired their board for the first 12 years that they were in existence. We've looked at a chronology, and we've divided the life of Jesus into 5 different phases. And I'm going to walk you through those phases as rapidly as I can today. We'll do a 30,000-foot overview. And one of those organizations I helped lead in my organizational leadership was called Concentric. And there are people in well over 100 countries on all 6 continents that look at this model of Jesus disciple making and look at how you build a movement based on the chronology, what Jesus did, when he did it, where he did it. So let's dive in, and we'll look at that preparation period you see on the chart right there. And that's the first 30 years of Jesus' life. And we talk about this because the start of the next period, next phase, that ministry foundations, is at the baptism of Jesus. And there Luke tells us that Jesus was about 30 years old. So that preparation period, first 30 years. And the Gospels begin with the genealogies, and then they begin with that great John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And what a classic passage. And then from there, they move into the Annunciation, the announcement from the angel Gabriel to Mary in Nazareth. And I think you've got some slides that would illustrate and show us a little bit about Nazareth. And there you can see that on the map, and especially on the right-hand map, John, one of my shorthand quick trips to learn Nazareth is always look to the very southern end of the Sea of Galilee and just go to the west, halfway between the Mediterranean and the Sea of Galilee. And there you're going to find Nazareth at the very southern tip, right in the middle as you move west. So tell us what else we're looking at here.
Well, this was the backyard of Jesus, like I like to say on our trips. Megiddo, Hill of Moreh, Mount Tabor, and of course the largest valley in Israel, the Jezreel Valley. But this ridge technically starts the lower Galilee, and there is Nazareth. It's really a large city today. Tell us a little about the church, Steve, here, the Church of Annunciation.
Well, you probably have spent a lot more time in that church through the years than I have, but again, marks the ruins of where the angel made the announcement. It's kind of the old core of small downtown original Nazareth. And John, I'm not sure what you think, but I usually read in terms of anywhere from 200 to 400 people were at Nazareth at this time that Jesus was there growing up.
Yeah, the church marks that annunciation. Of course, I don't go there at all either, but there are some first century ruins, and I think you're right. Nazareth was a small town. In fact, remember what Nathaniel asked in John 1, what good can come out of Nazareth? I'm
Ah.
glad, so glad that Philip responded, come and see. But uh, that's where it is, Nazareth, right here on the northern edge of the Jezreel Valley.
Well, right after that, John, we find out that Mary knows that Elizabeth is going to have a baby, and Mary goes down and visits Elizabeth at Ein Kerem, that village. And the Gospels then kind of look at John's birth and his early years. I think that Mary was there probably through John's birth. And when she came back home to Nazareth, I wonder if she looked a little different as she was moving along in her pregnancy and the conversations that she would have had with her mom and her family. And at a certain point in time, an angel had that conversation with Joseph. And remember, he was going to put her away privately, and then the angel convinced him what was going on. And so they were betrothed. And then after that, we had the announcement from Caesar Augustus that a census would take place. And if you follow the chronology, then they made the journey down to Nazareth because Joseph was of the line of David, the line coming from Nazareth. Talk a little bit about what we're looking at here, John.
Well, Bethlehem, this is the traditional shepherd's fields just to the east of Bethlehem proper. And it's a nice chapel designed by an Italian architect named Barluzzi, but we like to go there. And again, traditional place, but uh, again, when we talk about tradition, Steve, we're talking about a church that was built in about 325, 326, and it's called the Church of Nativity. And this is the inside of the church there. It's really a fascinating church, a lot of history, built, rebuilt, and of course, this is what we see today.
Well, when Jesus was 8 days old, he was circumcised. And then at 40 days, he was dedicated at the temple. And there, of course, you have the interaction with Simeon and Anna. And Simeon said, I can now go in peace. I've seen this deliverer that is going to come and rescue this nation. Simeon also at that point, John had said, this is going to be kind of the piercing of Mary's souls. And prophetically, he's talking about what Mary's going to have to deal with
Hmm.
as Jesus gets older and down the road that way. Well, I think what happened at this point, John, is instead of moving back to Nazareth, where they were from, I think as you look at the Gospels, they ended up probably making a quick trip to Nazareth fairly soon after the dedication and bringing a bunch of their things back down to Bethlehem. I think they determined that they were going to raise the son of David in the city of David.
Hmm.
And we see that with the Magi, because when the Magi come, they come to Bethlehem. They don't come to Nazareth. And after interacting with King Herod, Herod the Great, and his astrologers and his wise men, they go to Bethlehem because of the prophecy from the Old Testament. And when they get there, they have that great interaction. We read that Jesus is in the house. He's a boy. It's not listed like a baby anymore. And we know eventually they're warned in a dream to get out of there. And then when Herod comes to kill all the boy babies of Bethlehem, he does it with everyone that's 2 years old and younger. So
Hmm.
I really think that probably Jesus was between a year and a half years old by the time the Magi got there. And again, being warned in a dream, Joseph was visited 4 different times in dreams, and being warned in that dream, they headed off to Egypt. And your map shows the arrow going off the map down into Egypt. I'm not sure how long they were there, John. I think probably no longer than 2 years, might have even
Hmm.
been a little less time than that, knowing that when King Herod, Herod the Great, died, again, another dream comes to Joseph, and he's told, you can head back. And you can tell he's going to head back into Bethlehem, where they had been living, but he's warned in another dream about Archelaus. And Archelaus was one of the sons of Herod the Great, and he took over ruling Judea and Samaria. And Archelaus, I always like to say, was as bad as dad. And
Yeah.
the people didn't want him as a ruler. And I think Joseph and Mary, Joseph said, I'm going to take my family, go back to where we grew up in Nazareth, and it's not safe for us to go back to Bethlehem like we'd originally planned. So they head back to Nazareth, and I think you might have a couple of different slides just showing that region or that area. And as they head back there, Jesus, this is the area he grew up in. And again, we both said a smaller little town, not that large. And what's so funny in the Gospels, John, is uh, we get one little sentence in Luke 2:40 that
Hmm.
talks about the early life of Jesus from when he got back from Egypt until he was 12 years old. And it talks about his natural growth. It really highlights his humanity. And then when he is 12 years old, probably the end of that 12th year, we have one story from Jesus' life after Egypt. Only one story in those first 30 years. And that's when they take him to the temple, and he gets left behind at that temple. And so they would have made that long journey from Nazareth down the Jordan Valley and down to Jericho and up from Jericho. And then they would have met at the temple. And of course, we read the story, and Mary and Joseph are heading back down to Jericho. And it says 3 days later, they found him. Can you imagine
Hmm.
what was going through their mind when they're going, I thought he was with you. No, I thought he was with you. John, that used to always be my worst fear as a youth pastor back in the day before anyone had radios, cell phones, anything like that. And you had 4 or 5 vans of kids that you're taking across the country as some conference or mission trip. I thought they were in your van. It was the fear of leaving someone behind. Interestingly, even at 12 years old, Jesus said, didn't you know I had to be about my father's business in
Hmm.
my father's house? And I think Mary, as she had continued pondering all those things in her heart that she'd heard from the angels and all the different visitors, whether it was the shepherds and the magi filling everything in, she was instructing Jesus even in those early years, even in his humanity. Well, after that, again, we have another verse, and that's in Luke 2:51 and 52. And in those verses, it says, he grew in wisdom and favor and stature with God and man. John, there's so little written on these first 30 years once you get past the birth narrative and the time into Egypt. It's kind of really the silent years. And that Luke 2:51 and 52 passage really traces from age 13 all the way till he was an adult at age 30. I like Wayne Stiles. He has written a few good books and does a lot of work with kind of online things related to Israel.
Hmm.
And he said in these first 30 years, Jesus grew up with a hammer in one hand and a scroll in the other hand. Um, he learned the trade of his earthly father. Bible translates that as a carpenter. The word really is tekton, and it means a craftsman who builds. And he learned that in those first years, but a scroll in the other hand, as he learned about his heavenly father in his humanity that way. And so those are those first 30 years. And at that point, then Jesus' ministry gets launched and we start that second phase. And that second phase you see there is ministry foundations. And at the very bottom of that, it says 18 to 21 months. So, John, a year and a half to a year and 3/4 of Jesus' public ministry, which I look at as around 3.5 to 3 3/4 years, somewhere like that.
Hmm.
I mean, the bulk of it was spent in this ministry foundations phase. And let me just talk about a few things that happened during this time frame here. That launches, of course, with Jesus' baptism. And his baptism was Bethany beyond the Jordan, which was across the Jordan River from the area of Jericho. And you've probably been in those waters. I don't know, when you go on trips, John, do you usually baptize here or do you baptize up closer by the Sea of Galilee?
We do the northern location just because this is a really muddy, it's sort of dirty water, and I've done it actually here from the Jordanian side. In fact, this is the Jordanian side. This is how close we are, but I prefer the northern area. But what a experience as Jesus is set apart here. He's already been to the temple. We saw the steps in previous slides where Jesus would have entered the temple from the southern gates and then back to Nazareth and now set apart. I love this illustration. Compliments to Bible Illustrated for this image.
I love it too. And one of those first early notations that we see a few different times in the Gospels of the Trinity. Jesus, the Holy Spirit descending as a dove, and the voice from heaven saying, "This is my son, whom I love, with whom I'm well
Hmm.
pleased." And I tend to go to this location more than the other one, only because, John, this is such a crucial transition into
Hmm.
Jesus' public life. And at this location, now, was it right there where you showed in the previous slide? I think it's probably a 1/4 mile upstream or downstream, one way or the other. It was close by. This is the same location that ministry transitioned from Moses to Joshua as Joshua entered the land. This was the same location that ministry transitioned from Elijah to
Hmm.
Elisha when the waters parted. And now, instead of the waters parting like it did on both of those, now the sky is parting and the Holy Spirit's descending as a dove. And I think there's a reason Jesus was baptized and John was
Hmm.
baptizing at Bethany across from the Jordan, because this is a place of transitions. And this
That's a
is
great
Jesus
insight.
stepping into that calling right now. Well, immediately after this, he was led by the Spirit. And that Greek word really talks about thrust. He was thrust into the wilderness. He's just been, in essence, commissioned by that Holy Spirit and the words of his Father. By the way, I wonder if those are the first audible words he's heard from his Father in 30 years. I
Hmm.
mean, since he left heaven. And he's thrust into the wilderness. It's the Judean wilderness. Traditional spot is just above Jericho. And wow, look at how rough that area is, that terrain. That whole Judean wilderness is anywhere from 10 to 15 miles wide and probably 50, 60, 70 miles in length, just on the west side of the Dead Sea and then going north of the Dead Sea a little ways. And so he is tempted in the wilderness. And then it says the Holy Spirit leads him out of the wilderness. And when he leads him out of the wilderness, he runs into John again, and John and some of John's early disciples. And that's that classic statement John makes. Look, there's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And it says the next day he sees him and makes the same statement. And some of John's disciples, now they start to kind of hover around Jesus a little bit. And they've been hanging out with John, and John's been saying, I'm preparing the way, and I'm not the Messiah, and I'm not even worthy to unlatch his sandals. One's coming who has a lot of power, and he's going to baptize with the Spirit. I just baptize with water. And so they finally ask Jesus a question, and out of all the questions, they say, where are you staying? I kind of think they're tongue-tied here, John. I think they're thinking, I mean, I want to have this conversation, but I don't know how to get into it. And Jesus says, and you used the words earlier, come and see. And in disciple making, that's the first big challenge. Our challenge needs to be those people that we interact with around us to be able to say, come and see. Now, it doesn't mean just invite to church, come and see my pastor or our worship leader or our small group, our discipleship classes. I'm not knocking that, John, but the come and see is come and take a look and let's engage and let's have some dialogue and let's just continue to mull over who this Jesus person is. Come and see. Interestingly, what did the Samaritan woman say when she ran back into town? Come and see this
Yeah.
man who told me everything about me. So I think the come and see, it's where all of us live, work, study, and play, that as we build relationships, all of disciple making is relationships, John. And as we build those, we invite people to come and see. Well, it just blows me away. They spent anywhere from 4 to 8 hours with Jesus. And when they got done, those two of them, one of them came running out and he said, we have found the Messiah, which just blows me away. What happened in those conversations? What was going on? Was it kind of like the Emmaus Road, John,
Mm.
where at the end, post-resurrection, Jesus opens the scriptures? Did he ask him a bunch of questions? What did John teach you? What do you know from scriptures? But they came out saying, we found the Messiah. The next day, Jesus is going to head off to a wedding up in Cana, and he says, follow me. So now these disciples that had been following John start to follow Jesus. They become his early followers. And basically, he's saying, you've said that you found the Messiah, the anointed one. Now let's hang out and spend some time together. I want you to learn from me. I want you to shrink the distance between where you're at and where I'm at. I want you to walk in the dust of your rabbi, walking so close that we can learn from each other and sharpen each other. Well, they head to Cana, and this is the first of his name miracles, turning the water to wine. And John, talk a little bit about this, because I know this is not on anyone's itinerary, and I know you've gone there a few times recently. So tell us what you've got in these next few pictures.
Well, this is the tell of Kirbet Kana or Cana. I actually was there filming one trip and then took a group last May, but it's hard to get to. It's on the north side of the Beit Netofa Valley, and the primary archaeologist, I forget his name, an Israeli guy, thinks that this structure may be the synagogue, which would be one of 7 or 8 or 9, depending on how you count them. But these are the ruins. It was later inhabited by Byzantine Christians, but this is the beautiful scene. Here's the Beit Netofa Valley, and Nazareth is right there, right on the ridge. So this is how close it is. And as Jesus spent time in the desert in John 1 is so rich, you articulate it so well. Here's John 2, and perhaps it happened in this city identified by archaeologists as Cana.
Well, it's interesting. The Gospels then say, following this wedding feast, Jesus with his disciples and his family went to Capernaum. Now, he didn't move there at this point in time, John. I think he's going to spy out the land. I think he's being led by the Spirit,
Hmm.
probably going one day you might end up here. And they spend some time there. Doesn't say what they're doing or how long. Then back to Nazareth, and soon after that becomes the first public Passover of Jesus' ministry, his public ministry. And so he heads down to Jerusalem, and he takes those disciples with him, and they head down to Jerusalem for that first Passover down there. And this is the cleansing of the temple and what's happening in the temple there in Jerusalem. And so,
Let me just interject, Steve, so we
yeah,
can explain this slide. Capernaum ended up, I believe, and you would agree, I'm sure, as sort of his home base area for his ministry. This late fourth, early fifth century synagogue is probably built on the first century one, but you can see
yep,
primarily first century ruins, houses, and so forth. So, but again, Jesus was going back and forth many times to Jerusalem.
yes, yep,
And wow, that's about a week, 10 days trip, 70, 80 miles, depending on whether they're coming from the Nazareth area or the lake or the Sea of
yep.
Galilee area. That's a lot of travel.
He was always on the move. And again, as you see the terrain from the lush beauty of the north all the way down to the rugged wilderness as you move down towards the Dead Sea. Talk a little bit about this route heading up there.
Well, you mentioned, Steve, that most Jews, when they made one of three primary pilgrimages to Jerusalem each year for the three high holidays. Whether you're from the lower Galilee or the lake area, you would travel southward down the valley, then to Jericho, and then literally ascend up through the desert. It's called the ascent of Adumim and to Jerusalem. Uh, Not only is the hike or walk long, but it's uphill this last a bit of it, and you can see the most likely path that actually has been discovered by uh, scholars and so forth. At least portions of this Roman road, some Roman mile markers were actually found, but what a
Yep.
difficult last approach to Jerusalem, straight uphill, and look at the elevation gain. Now, maybe
It's
this
amazing.
topography is a
Like,
little exaggerated, but it's over a 4,000-foot climb
yep.
to Jerusalem and through a very desolate, dry area. I also love this old picture, compliments of Todd Bolin. Sorry, I didn't mention that at the bottom, but this is the an older road that went right through the area of Bethany, the home of Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Simon the leper. And there's the Temple Mount. So we use this old, I don't know, 100 years old picture maybe to illustrate that even the roads today probably preserved the way that Jesus eventually entered this area of Jerusalem, including Nazareth, right? Excuse me, Bethany right there.
Yeah, and John, when you and I went to school, we could walk back and forth from Jerusalem to Bethany all the time. And we did
Hmm.
that a few times. And Bethpage just a little bit above the big white circle and right in the middle there. And now, of course, with security fences in there and everything, you can't make that direct route like we used to.
And there's the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives, which is actually higher than the Temple Mount, really helping us remember what Psalm 125 says as the mountains surround Jerusalem.
Yes.
So Jesus then comes from Bethany, from the desert initially, down the Mount of Olives, and then spending time once again in the temple.
And that was also the time frame when he was there after cleansing that temple. We see, of course, his interaction with Nicodemus. That's during that time frame and that visit there. And then after Nicodemus, John 3:22 is a portion I really
Mm.
like. Um, and John 3:22 says that he and his disciples are in the Judean countryside and he's spending time with them. And that Greek word is diatribo. And so he would have been in the Jerusalem area. It doesn't talk about the wilderness, it's the countryside around there. And diatribo means being so close that you're kind of rubbing off on each other. It's relational. All disciple making is relationships. And this is that ministry foundations time. He's spending time with them. Think of all the different places they've been already in these 18 to 21 months. Well, when he's there, John, he hears word that John the Baptist has been put in prison.
Hmm.
And John the Baptist has been put in prison by Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas ruled the Galilee and ruled Perea. You can see the Galilee and Perea on that left-hand map, Perea right there. Perea is never mentioned in the Gospels, but it's mentioned on all the maps and the historical and geographical literature of the time. Bible always talks about that as the land across the Jordan and across the river that way. And so he's put in prison at Machaerus, and you're highlighting that right there on the northeast corner of this Dead Sea in modern country of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And I know you've been there many different times,
Hmm.
and it's a great location. And John, I think John the Baptist was probably in prison there for a good year before he was finally killed. That's my best thinking. So Jesus hears about John, and all of a sudden he said, I'm going to head back home to the Galilee. In essence, John had been his covering. Even after his baptism and all this time, John is still up and down the Jordan baptizing. If there was water, someone was getting wet as long as John was around. And at this point now, his covering, I mean, John had been the Billy Graham of the day. And so Jesus goes, I'm going to head back to Galilee, but I must go through Samaria. And again, stretching the disciples' view and helping them understand these are people that are different than you. They're so surprised at his interaction with the Samaritan woman. They can't quite figure that out even when they come back in John chapter 4. And I think you've got some pictures there you can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, so Jesus takes the route straight north through the Samaritan Hills, which are really large uplifted limestone. It's a beautiful area. The patriarchs walked through here, journeyed through here oftentimes, but this encounter, Steve, with the woman at the well at Sychar, is really transformational as well.
Yeah, very, very much so. And when you think of it, she becomes John the Baptist for the Samaritans.
Yeah.
And she runs back into town and she goes, Come and see this man who told me everything about me. They come out and interact with Jesus. They invite him into town. He stays a few days and sees huge transformation that takes place. Well, then he continues back on to Galilee. And here's
By
a
the
good
way,
picture.
here's
Yep,
Cana, because he visits Cana.
yep.
So two visits now, John 2, John 4, excuse me, but that's just a great, beautiful area um, of this Beit Netofa Valley and the area where Jesus spent time. But he does go apparently back through Nazareth, and here's the precipice.
And interesting, John, I mean, that Cana, that was a miracle from a distance. It was,
Yeah.
the person from Capernaum that had a child that was very ill, and Jesus said, Your child's healed. And then Jesus goes to Nazareth and in the synagogue. Now, think about this, John. He is handed the scroll, he reads from the Isaiah passage and everyone's so excited. This is the hometown boy made good. They'd heard about what had happened down in Passover and all of the excitement that way and everything. And then he gives two illustrations in his sermon. Tells you got to be careful about your illustrations, right?
Yeah.
And they're both having to do with non-Jewish people that experience the grace of God, the Syrophoenician woman and Naaman the Syrian. And at that point, those people turned on him and they were going to throw him off the cliff. And this is the traditional cliff, the Nazareth precipice, a wonderful place to visit. I know all of our trips do, yours probably do too, as we sit up and look at all the geography that Jesus was exposed to in this area. And after
So this is where we will cut our session in half with Steve Hudson, and we will post shortly the second half of this session on the chronology of Jesus. Incidentally, we will be also recording a complete session specifically about the chronology of Jesus during his Passion Week in Jerusalem, so you won't want to miss that as well. So once again, thanks for joining us, and until next time, Shalom.